congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I mean, 2 months later and you're still on the New York Times bestseller list. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So what do you, like, when you think about that, like, what do you attribute, like, what is it about the book that you think is connecting with people so much?
I think that everybody sees pieces of themselves in the people that I'm writing about, including my story. And I think that's what we read for. I think a lot of the time we want to see our lives reflected in someone else's experience. And I think that it's resonating because it's nonfiction. These are real people. And I think so much of the time we think, oh, I'm the only one who thinks that or feels that or does that. And then when you see other people who are doing that or thinking that or feeling that, I think that's such a profound experience.
Yeah. I also think that as somebody who's been in therapy, in and out of therapy for many years, I found myself sitting across from my therapist thinking, like, what is this person's life all about? And there's such a conscious effort to, maintain that barrier and that boundary. And for you to peel that back and reveal your humanity, I think is unique and super interesting. And I don't know whether it's comforting or disturbing to find out that your therapist is actually a human being, going through a lot of the same challenges that we all go through.
Right. I talk about that tension in the book between wanting your therapist to be a human being who has life experience. Nobody wants to go and talk to a robot or a brick wall. But on the other hand, I think there's that tension because people want their therapist to have worked everything out, to kind of be ahead of them.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, I think I just lost my train of thought. What am I trying to say? I'm interested in, let me just restart that thought. I mean, I'm interested in how this has affected your practice going forward, in the sense that, as somebody who's looked at my therapist and thought, I don't know anything about this person, now you're sitting across from people who presumably have read your book and now know a lot about you. Has that changed the way your therapeutic modality or what that relationship looks like?
It's interesting because I didn't know how that would affect the people that I'm currently seeing. So all the people that I write about are people that I'm no longer seeing. And when I got back from book tour, sometimes people would come in and sit down on the couch and the first thing they'd say is, so I read your book, which I never mentioned my book before I left. I just said, I'm going to be away on these dates. And so we, would talk about it in terms of them, in terms of their experience of reading the book and what it was like for them to read that.
Yeah. But you still try to keep that boundary up.
Oh yeah. We didn't talk about the things that I talked about in the book because it's not helpful for them. They're there for them.
Yeah.
Other people came in and haven't said a word, and I'm sure they know about the book. But, I think that for them it's more comfortable, which I understand. It's more comfortable for them to kind of compartmentalize that part, the writing part of my life, from the fact that they have this therapeutic relationship with me.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about is never, Google your therapist.
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, everyone who's sitting with you has, or knows these things about you. I would imagine there's probably a pretty big influx of people now that are trying to become your patient.
Right. And the irony is that I thought that once I wrote this book, nobody would want to be my patient just because they would know too much. Not that there's anything strange about what I reveal in the book, but just that they now have a lot of information about me that they wouldn't have about another therapist.
But I think it speaks to another thing that you talk about, and an issue that I feel strongly about, which is when you have the courage to be vulnerable on that level and to show your humanity, it creates connectivity. You think it's going to repel people, but actually it magnetizes them to you.
It does. And that was a big message of the book was, you see the people in the book as they struggle to kind of keep you away from whatever the truth of who they are is. And they think that they'll be more, better liked, better, more well-respected, and that if they show the truth of who they are, that people will run.
Yeah.
And instead, people are drawn toward that. That's the glue that connects people.
Why is it so hard, though? Why is it so hard for us to just be honest? I mean, I'm a pathological people pleaser. I've had many experiences in therapy. You talk about this too, like trying to win over the therapist or, not being honest because I just want to, covet or curry favor with the person.
Yeah. There is a performative aspect, I think, when people first come in, for a lot of people, not everybody, where, they want the therapist to find them, entertaining, witty, smart. They'll agree with a lot of what you say, even though they don't necessarily agree with it. And you look for that as a therapist. Are they trying to get me to like them? And is that getting in the way of us having a much more authentic conversation?
So when someone comes in and you can sense that, what is the strategy for getting them to, open up a little bit more, or peel back that layer?
Well, I think, sometimes in LA too, you have people who are maybe like comedy writers and they come in and they're sort of, they feel like they're in the writer's room and they're trying to be funny and hey, look at me. And I'm not responding to that in the way that they want me to respond to that. Therapy isn't the cocktail hour. It's
a mask.
Right. And in this room, I'm saying to them by my lack of response, right? In this room, we're going to do something different than you do out there.
Mm-hmm. That's scary.
It is scary. So even for people who are not, doing this job of trying to entertain people, we all try to entertain people. That's what we do out in the world. That's our social face. And the therapy room is about, hey, I'm going to see something about you that you are trying to hide, and you're going to find that it's actually beautiful. Mm.
Well, we all have these blind spots that, kind of create, repetitive crises and problems in our lives. And no matter, it's sort of like, until you reach that point where you're in sufficient amount of pain as a result of this, it's very difficult to identify that or to see it. And it takes someone like yourself to be able to point that out. I'm curious about what you've learned about how we, why is it that it's so difficult for us to see these things that continually trip us up, that are perhaps easily identifiable to the people that are around us?
It's so much easier it's kind of like having, like on a Google map, right? If you can zoom out, you can see things so much more clearly. Mm-hmm. So other people have the vantage point of not living our lives. They're outside of our lives. And so much of the time people will come in and they're complaining about something external, that the problem is their partner, their child, their parent, their boss, their coworker, the society, the culture, whatever it is. And all of those things might be true. But at the same time, what are they doing that is, it's almost like they're shooting themselves in the foot, and they're over and over and over, and they end up stuck in the same place. And they can't see that their response to whatever's going on in the world is part of the problem too, that they have a role in their own lives.
Right.
A lot of people will come in and act like, the world is happening to me and I have no role in this. I have no agency in this.
Right. You call it the presenting problem, right? Somebody comes in, I'm in a relationship crisis, or something's happening at work, or whatever it is. And your process is to then get behind that and look at the behaviors and the actions and the responses that have kind of cultivated that repetitive situation in their lives over time.
Yeah. I always like to say that I'm listening for the music under the lyrics, that they're telling me about a situation, and I'm kind of listening for, well, what is the underlying struggle or pattern that got you into this situation in the first place? And this is something so different from what our friends do. Mm-hmm. So if you tell your friends something, I talk in the book about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. Idiot compassion is what our friends do. Yeah, he's a jerk. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. That person wronged you. Wise compassion is what a therapist does, which is we hold up the mirror and help people see their reflection in a way that nobody else is going to do for them.
Mm-hmm. But why is it, what is the rationale or the thinking behind the not reluctance, but the the kind of refusal actually to give proactive advice. Like you see these people come in, I'm sure the problems are very similar to each other with all the patients that you've treated. I would imagine that you can easily identify within moments like what this person's core thing is. And do you have to hold yourself back from saying, listen, you just need to like see this thing and stop doing this one thing? But
that's such a misconception about therapy is that we have the answer, right? And we're withholding it for some reason. I have this word taped up in my office, ultracrepidarianism, which translates roughly to the habit of giving advice outside of one's knowledge or competence. Mm-hmm. And the reason that I love that word is because I may know what I would do in that situation, but I don't know what you should do in that situation because I can't live your life for you. Mm-hmm. So part of it is that. There are a few other reasons too. One is that when you come in and tell me a story, you're telling me the story through your lens. If other people involved in the story were also to tell me the story, I'd have so much more information that might change my advice.
Right.
Because you're telling me this story, and you're almost gunning for me to take a position. And so if I had a broader sense of the problem by knowing like what are the other people doing in this story too, that might alter the advice that I would give. Mm-hmm. So I might be giving bad advice if I'm only giving it based on your one version of the story. And the other part of it is that we want to encourage people's independence. We want people to be able to make better choices in their own lives. So if every time they need to make a decision, they say, oh, I've got to ask my therapist. Well, we're doing you a disservice. It's like with your children, you want them to grow up and be able to not need you in the same way anymore.
It almost feels like inception, like you need them to come to this realization on their own so that they can own it and fully comprehend it for themselves rather than being told, like to establish some level of agency and deep self-understanding, self-knowledge around these issues so that they can, kind of rewire their brains to respond in a different and healthier manner.
Right. So many people are making decisions based on some historical artifact that they're carrying around from their past in terms of how they think about themselves or the world. Like if their narrative is something like, nothing will ever work out for me, or their narrative is, I'm unlovable, they're going to make choices through that lens. So one of the jobs of therapy is to help them see this narrative, this faulty narrative that you're walking around with, and it's influencing the way that you make decisions on a daily basis.
Yeah. But why can't you just tell them that?
We do.
Oh, you do?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. So we're not like these ciphers who are holding back information. We want people to leave as soon as they can. But sometimes people aren't ready to hear something. So you have to say it in lots of different ways, and timing and dosage are so important, right?
How do you gauge that? Like, how do you get to the point where you believe someone's ready to hear something that you've been waiting to say for a long time?
You float it out there and you see what their response is. And if they recoil, you backtrack a little bit. You don't backtrack, meaning you don't take back what you said, but you say, okay, I'm going to have to go in a different way, or I'm going to have to time this differently. I'm going to have to plant some seeds before they're ready to really look at this.
Mm-hmm. And what's the process when somebody comes into your office, they sit down and they say, I'm just not fulfilled, or I have some low-grade anxiety or depression, or I just feel a little bit lost, but I don't have any identifiable childhood trauma. There's no big inciting incident. There's no precipitating event that I can, look to as an explanation for how I feel. I'm just confused and I don't know what to do. Like, how do you unpack that? I would imagine that's a pretty common condition.
It is. So we look at what is going on in this person's life. And as they start to talk, often what happens is there is more going on. I don't mean that they had childhood trauma. I just mean that the situation is more complicated than they initially presented it.
Right. And that's a process of slowly peeling back the layers and learning more about their life, or how does that look from where you sit?
Yeah, you have to really get to know somebody. And sometimes you have to help them get to know themselves. A lot of people come in and they think that they know themselves, and they don't necessarily know some key pieces of information about themselves, what makes them tick or how they're relating to people. So that's really important. And I think the other thing is sometimes it's a case of the person doesn't really know him or herself very well, but sometimes it's a case of getting to unknow yourself, meaning you have this idea about yourself that is holding you back. And you need to unknow that because it's limiting you.
Yeah. We all have these stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do and why we react and behave in the manner that we do. And the more I kind of learn about this world, the more I realize that these stories are essentially fallacies, in the positive and in the negative.
Well, they're very subjective. And I think none of us want to think that. We all want to think that the stories that we're telling are very objective. Here's what happened. Here's what he said. Then I said this. Then he said this. And here's what happened. And it feels very objective when you're telling the story. And that's why I wanted to include my own story in the book, because you can see my evolution as I go from this person who has this very, clear cut in my mind story about what happened with my boyfriend. And as we start to unpack this, it becomes much more nuanced.
Right. So tell the story a little bit so people understand. I mean, basically, you're in a relationship and the guy decides to leave, which is a big surprise to you. And this kind of, leads you into, a journey of self-discovery of your own. Yeah.
So, originally I was going to write about these 4 patients and not include my story, but this is what was going on while I was seeing these 4 patients. I was going to get married to this boyfriend and we were planning to get married. We talked about it all the time. We had, I was about to move in with him. And, he had just checked with his HR department about whether he could put my son on the medical insurance when we got married. It was not like some vague idea.
And you weren't imagining this.
Right. Exactly. And then one night, we're just having a normal conversation and he gets quiet. In this way, there's not the comfortable silence that, people in couples are, used to and really enjoy. And I noticed that his foot is shaking, like kind of up and down. And I say, "What's up?" And nothing. But what comes out is he's decided he can't live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years. That kid is my 8-year-old. Who had not been hiding in a closet the entire time that we were dating. And he had been really grappling with this, but he didn't tell me because he really wanted to be able to work this out for himself. He really wanted to get past this feeling of, oh my God, I'm going to have to sort of, go back to this child raising part when my kids are about to leave for college. And I was really looking forward to the empty nest. And he just didn't tell me about it the whole time that, he wasn't grappling with it the whole time. It had been going on for a few months for him. And finally he tells me this.
Right.
And we had just picked our movie for the weekend,
Right.
It was one of those things where you're kind of like, when were you going to tell me and how is this going to come up? So my version of the story, and I very intentionally say my version of the story, was that, he's a jerk. I mean, how could you date someone for this long and say you're going to marry this person and get to know this person's child and then all of a sudden come to this conclusion when the kid was there the whole time?
Right. Did you also feel like the fact that you're a therapist, a psychotherapist, that you should have been able to see these signs coming along the way?
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're specifically trained to be able to identify these things. That must have been, compounded the confusion of the whole experience for you.
Right. And I think that's why I stuck to my story so vehemently, because if I acknowledged that I had missed all these things, then what did that say about me?
Right. And you should be somebody who doesn't have blind spots. So the realization is sort of, well, even though I do this for a living and I know all this stuff, I still don't fully understand my own internal roadmap.
Yeah. And I think, as a therapist, we know that we have our blind spots, but this was such a glaring one that I think I felt a lot of shame around it.
Right.
How could I, of all people, have missed this?
Right. So enter Wendell.
Yeah. So I think enter Wendell, stage left. So what happens is I don't even consider going to therapy because it seems so clear cut to me that, okay, well, boy, as my friend said, boy, did you dodge a bullet. Good thing you found this out about him. What else was he hiding? Right. So he became demonized. He became the villain, the boyfriend. And I just thought, well, I'm going to move on from this and move forward. But I wasn't moving on. I was a mess. I mean, professionally, I was fine. Like it was actually respite from the sort of, all of the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. But once I would go home and then once I'd get my son settled and, that would be over, I could distract myself with my son. There was this gaping hole. I mean, that's where boyfriend was, right? I call him boyfriend in the book. That's where he was. And, I was like unable to focus. I was unable to sleep. I was, I like tripped on a step in my garage and like badly bruised my knee. I left my credit card at Target. I was just sort of like not there. And a friend of mine who is a therapist said, maybe you should talk to someone. And so I thought, well,
hence the title of the book.
Right, hence the title of the book. Yeah. And I thought, great, crisis management. I'll go in, I'll get through this crisis, and then I'll be good to go. And of course, that's not what happens.
And that was your first experience with doing therapy yourself?
I think a lot of people who become therapists have done their own therapy because they're really interested in understanding themselves better. And then as part of our training, we do 500 hours of therapy. But I think it's really different going to a therapist when you're an intern and you don't really feel like a therapist yet. You very much feel like the patient. Later, when you have your own practice and you've been doing this for a while, when you go back to therapy, it feels very different because you sort of have your therapist hat on at the same time that you're the patient, at least initially for me. That's how it was.
Right. And do you feel like you're sort of calcified around these ideas? Like, oh, I see why you're asking me this. Like, it's sort of like if you're you come from television development. Like if you've been in the entertainment industry, it's hard to go to a movie and just immerse yourself in the story. You're like deconstructing the whole thing and trying to figure out why they made these choices. Is that a similar experience, like going into therapy as a therapist?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I know that trick.
That's a great example. It's almost like a magician going to a magician. It's like, oh, I know how that was done. So in my first session, I feel like I know why he's asking certain questions, and I answer in a way that, again, going back to that performative aspect, that will make me look good. And also, I don't want to delve into anything else because I don't think there's anything else to delve into.
It's so hilarious,
isn't it? Isn't it how blind we can be to ourselves? And right in the first session, I'm talking about everything that has happened. I'm telling this story, of course, so that I come off as the hero and the boyfriend comes off as the villain. And but I don't realize I'm doing that. I mean, that's the important thing is I don't realize I'm doing that. It's very much just how I'm telling the story. And what happens is I say at one point, now I've wasted all this time and I'm in my 40s and half my life is over. And my therapist gloms onto that phrase, half my life is over. And he keeps trying to direct me back to that. And I'm like, I didn't mean anything, but it meant everything.
Right. In other words, this fear that you're missing out on some aspect of life, and this was your opportunity to have that, and now it's gone. And what does this say about how you're going to be living from here on out?
Well, I think what happens is I think that we think of grief as being something in the present, right? Like, I miss this person today. This person isn't with me today. I miss this person's presence. But we're also grieving the future. We had a whole future with this person that now has to be rewritten. And so when I said half my life is over, there were other things going on in my life that I wasn't even really thinking about because I could distract myself with, I'm going to get married to this person and that's going to be my future. But there were definitely other things in my life that I wasn't addressing. And what was really happening was I was looking for meaning. I was looking for, how do I want to spend my time much more intentionally now that I'm aware of my mortality, now that I'm in my 40s and I realize that I don't have forever. How do I want to think about that? And I wasn't willing to think about that until this breakup happened.
And so how has that changed? Like, how do you think about that now versus then?
Well, a couple other things were going on at the time. One was I was supposed to be writing a book about happiness.
That's an interesting story, actually. Can you share a little bit about how the book changed from what it was supposed to be into what it became?
Yeah. So originally I had written this cover story for The Atlantic called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. And the subtitle was Why Our Obsession with Our Kids' Happiness Might Be Dooming Them to Unhappy Adulthood.
Right. I want to put a bookmark on that because I want to get back to that, but go ahead.
Sure. So it went viral. It spread like wildfire.
Yeah, it was like the most emailed story in
like the 100-year history of The Atlantic. Right. Publishers, of course, wanted me to write the book version of that. And it was this crazy thing where they offered me a tremendous amount of money. And I was a single parent, and, this could really change the landscape of our day to day with what they were offering me. It was an easy book to write because I'd already written the article. But I said no. And I said no because I felt like I didn't really have a lot more to say. I could easily eke out a book, but I felt like there was something fraudulent about it. It didn't feel authentic. It felt like I would be sort of jumping on the parenting bandwagon. Mm-hmm. There had already been a lot of great books written about that. What would mine add to it? And so I said no, and everyone thought I was insane. And I said, I was starting out as a therapist at the time, and I said, I'm really interested in what's happening with the adults. I want to write about the adults. And so they said, well, write a book about happiness, which even though I didn't want to write a book about happiness, I thought I can make it the book that I want to make it. But and they didn't offer me, by the way, that amount of money to do this. So it was doubly stupid. And every day I would sit down to try to write this book, and every day I was paralyzed. I could not write this book because I felt like it just didn't reflect the nuances of what I was seeing in the therapy room, what real life was like. The studies just can't really convey that in the same way. But my agent said, well, if you don't write this book, you'll never write another book because you turned down the kid book, and now you're going to screw up this happiness book. So just write this book, and then you can write what you want. But I absolutely could not do it. And I was telling no one. And I was so ashamed of it. I was so ashamed that this was happening. I say in the book that I was like the closet gambler who gets dressed for work in the morning and says they're going to the office, but drives to the casino instead. My casino was Facebook, right? I would just sit on Facebook. I was dating my boyfriend, and I would write these fabulously long, witty emails to him, but I would not write this book. And I couldn't tell anybody. And, anyone that would ask, I'd say, yeah, it's coming along. It's coming along. And I didn't even tell my therapist. It was this big secret that I couldn't tell anyone because I kept thinking, well, at some point I'll just write it, but I couldn't.
Right. So how did you get over that? How did you see your way through?
Eventually, secrets are this thing where Carl Jung calls secrets psychic poison because they're so corrosive, but also they're all about shame. And so this was a secret that was all about shame for me. And the thing about secrets is once you reveal them, everything opens up for you. And so when I finally told my therapist that this had been going on, I felt this lightness. I felt like I don't have to carry this burden with me, like this albatross around my neck, that somebody else knows this. I am not alone in this now. And when I told him about it, it wasn't that he could solve my problem. He didn't know anything about the publishing world. And in fact, he at a certain point gave me some really not good advice about it. But what happened was it made me really have to focus on it. Once you reveal the secret, you can't deny that it exists anymore. You have to deal with it. And so eventually I canceled the book contract, even though I have to return the money that was paying for my internship. It felt so good to tell my editor, I can't write this book. Right. This doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't feel authentic. I feel like this is not the book I want to write. I don't know if there's another book that I'm ever going to write, but I'm going to cancel this book. I am so sorry. And my editor was lovely. And in fact, when this book came out, maybe you should talk to someone. She was the first person to say to me, I read your book. It's amazing. This was so much the book you had to write.
That's great because I could easily also see her saying, well, you'll never work in this town again. It was the two opposite. Strikes and all of that. So the book that you did end up writing was with a different editor, obviously, and a different house.
It was with a different editor. But she would, she very much said, I would love to work with you. Yeah. But mostly she said this book, she really is in therapy herself. And she talked about like how much it resonated with her personally, that how much it changed her life, just reading the book. And that was it felt so gratifying, given how long I spent in that like that secrecy of, I can't tell anybody that this is the wrong book.
Right. And the lesson that I gather from that is that, the creative output has to be authentic to you. Like you can't write a book that you're not feeling.
Right. And I think that somehow, in some ways I was even worried about putting it in. Maybe you should talk to someone, because I thought, who's going to relate to this? They'll think, who's this first
right.
world problem person who like has a book contract and she can't, girl. Right. But I think that it's applicable to anybody, because first of all, I was really struggling with something about, what am I doing with my life in this profound way? So many of us wonder, especially when we get to midlife, like, am I making the choices I want to make? Am I living the way that I want to live? Am I wasting my time? And so I think with this book, it was about, I can't do something that feels false anymore. I have to be true to who I am, even if I'm going to suffer consequences. And there were significant consequences, by the way. It wasn't like this easy thing where you say, okay, I'm going to cancel this book contract. It was like, we had to change our lifestyle in order for me to cancel that book. And it was really hard.
Wow. Well, in the book, you also, at the same time that you're, telling this story about yourself, you're also tracking a couple individuals and their stories. So, are these people like amalgams of several patients? Or are they certain individuals that you then got permission from to tell their stories? Or how did that whole process work?
That's a great question. So I addressed that in an author's note, but I think a lot of people are curious about that because especially if they're in therapy, I think they wonder, is somebody going to write about me one day?
Or like when someone comes to see you, like, is this going to end up in a book somewhere or in the Atlantic?
Right. Well, first of all, so there are two separate issues. One is, I think with a therapist who's not a writer, that's handled differently. In my situation, I was a writer before I became a therapist. And so in my informed consent, I say that people can end up in my writing as long as I disguise all of the identifying details. In this case, I wasn't comfortable writing about people that I was currently seeing because I felt that I couldn't go to a session and then be writing about that the lines were too blurred. And so I only wrote about people that I was no longer seeing. I, of course, got permission. And some of them are composites, meaning I might take something from a very similar patient that didn't happen to the patient that I was writing about, but it was so similar and there was something too revealing about the original patient. Right. So I used this other example. But I think every story is very true to the experience of what it was like to treat that patient and what that patient went through.
Yeah. Have you talked to any of these people since the book has come out?
Yes, I have.
What do they tell you?
I think everybody's really proud of it. I feel like they feel like I honored their experience in the book. And also they know why I was writing it, because I wanted to I think what happens in the therapy room is it's you and another person and no one ever sees it. And so much happens in the therapy room that is transformative, or there are these heroic moments. You see people change in these ways. It's almost like if you could do that time-lapse photography, you don't see like these huge changes every session, but over time, you see someone really transform. And I wanted to bring that experience into, to a broader audience. And so I think that the people in the book are really glad that it's out there. I think it's done so much to kind of normalize the human experience in a way that if people are just in rooms talking privately, nobody really knows that other people are going through something very similar.
Yeah. So no one was like, well, I told you could write about me, but I didn't know you were going to write about that part. Like it's all good.
I didn't write about anything that we hadn't already talked about in therapy. It wasn't. So I think, part of the appeal too of the book, I think, is that people get to hear, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is your therapist what's really going on in your therapist's mind? And I think that they're pleased when they hear that. It's not, we don't want to be sort of these wizards that are, holding these secrets. And so I think that anything that I was thinking or feeling while I was seeing these patients, I brought up in the room at the time. right? Or maybe I didn't bring it up at the time, like with John, who is this very difficult to like patient at the very beginning. He's very narcissistic. He's abrasive. He insults me. I didn't say what I was thinking in that moment, but later on, and you could see in the book when he says, "Do you think I'm an asshole?" Right?
Yeah.
And how I answer that, which is very truthfully about sometimes he comes off in a way that makes people think he's an asshole.
Right.
Right.
And so John's this big shot producer. You track him. You have this Charlotte is her name, the woman who ends up in all these bad relationships with guys. You have an elderly woman who's contemplating suicide. How did you decide these are going to be like the test cases, or what is the identifiable through line in the challenges that they're facing and grappling with that made it relevant to the narrative that you wanted to tell?
I wanted to pick a variety of stories. So all of these people look so different on the surface, different ages, different gender, different histories, different personalities, different, time of life, everything. But I think that what I do with the stories is I think that they're all in conversation with each other, because I think that all of the patients have something in common with one another, and I'm the fifth patient and I have something in common with all of them. And I think the reader, patient by proxy maybe, has something in common with all five of us. I liked their stories because I think that they show how you can think something about a person at the beginning and how that can change so much over the course of getting to know them. So I think these were very vivid examples of that.
Yeah. I've heard you say as well that there's this adage that the modality of therapy is less important than the sort of connectivity or the bond that you establish with the person that you're seeing. It's that relationship, the intimacy of that relationship, and the honesty that it's infused with that really makes the difference in whether a patient is going to see results or not.
Yes. Yeah. So that's really interesting because study after study shows that more than the therapist modality or their years of experience or, the kind of whether their gender, those kinds of things. The most important thing is whether you have chemistry with your therapist. How does it click? And I think that people kind of think that they're coming in and talking about outside relationships, and they don't realize that they're also having a relationship with the therapist. And what people do in the therapy room is a microcosm of what they do out there. So if somebody's avoidant out there, they're going to be avoidant with you. If somebody, goes off on tangent after tangent to distract you from, whatever they want to talk about, they'll probably do that out there too. If somebody's a people pleaser, they'll do that with you too.
And how long do you think, what is the typical length of treatment with your patients? How long do they stay with you, and when is it appropriate to move on? Is that just a very personal thing?
Yeah, it totally depends on what they're there for and what their goals are. I think that there's this misconception about therapy that people come to therapy, they talk about their childhood ad nauseum, and they never leave. And that's just not true. We talk about goals from the very first session. Why are you here? What's going on? And we try to understand more about what their problem is right away. Some people are coming in because they have a very discrete problem, and some people are coming in because there's something more amorphous, like a feeling of stuckness or a free-floating anxiety.
I just got back from Europe. My wife and I, we host these retreats. We've been doing it for a number of years, and we take a group. We had 45 people in Italy, and we took them through a 7-day experience. And a lot of it is fun. We just, we eat amazing food and we meditate and we do stuff like that. But we also do these workshops and try to really help people confront and grapple with, some of the issues that they face. And one of the things that was really striking to me about this experience is that the condition, almost unanimously amongst this group, the main thing that they're confronting in their lives is this feeling of not being enough. It was kind of amazing. Almost every single person identified that as the thing that they really struggle with. And I'm interested in whether that's mirrored in your own practice and experience and what that's about.
Yeah, I think that that's so true. I think about Charlotte in the book, who's this young woman who's in her 20s. And as you were saying, she keeps hooking up with the wrong guys, including one from the waiting room, where she thinks that's a step up because she says, well, at least he's in therapy.
That guy was a bad boy though, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. So her kind of picker was off. But she also has an alcohol addiction that she's not really willing to look at. She thinks she's just kind of a social drinker, and she's not. And I think that this feeling of not enoughness, we mask it with all kinds of things, with addictive behaviors. You see a lot of people who are, using all kinds of substances to mask that. Even the internet. One of my colleagues calls the internet the most effective short-term non-prescription painkiller out there. I think we distract ourselves from that feeling of not enoughness. And so when you're in the therapy room and you don't have those distractions, because we don't use our phones in there's nothing pinging, dinging, vibrating. You're not having a drink. There's nothing, just the I, thou of the room. That comes out a lot. And I think that people feel so, they compare themselves so much. There's so much comparison going on. And I don't know whether it's worse because of, Instagram and Facebook and all of that. But I think people always compare themselves unfavorably to other people. Or if they compare themselves favorably, there's this narcissism, like in John's case, right, in the book. And I always say to people, you need to compare yourself to yourself. That, where were you before and where have you come? And it takes away from that sense of like, I'm not good enough, because you're not looking at people out there. You're looking at yourself. And a lot of times, I think too, people are so unkind to themselves.
Yeah.
So, I think this feeling of not enoughness has to do with the way that we talk to ourselves too. Whose voice is that? I had this one patient write down everything she said to herself, like in her head, for a few days. She came back and she was so embarrassed. She was hesitant to read it to me. She's like, I can't read this out loud. I can't say this out loud. Yeah. And when she did, it was like, she's like, I'm a bully. Like I'm horrible to myself. So many of us don't notice the ways that we talk to ourselves. And it comes from this feeling of like, what's wrong with you? We literally say things like that to ourselves.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and the relationship that we have with ourselves, we would never have with another human being.
Nobody would talk to us.
If life talked to us like that, we wouldn't be friends with that person, right? And I'm wondering whether there's something specific that's going on in our culture that has made this so acute right now. I mean, certainly I think social media fuels this, but maybe something else outside of that as well. I mean,
I think there's this sense of disconnection that does. Yeah. So no matter what people come in with, I feel like there's this underlying sense of loneliness. Even if people are, they're happily married, or they have lots of friends or family, people tend to feel disconnected from the people that are important to them. So many of us are not, like, just sitting face to face with somebody else. Sometimes the only experience they get of that, with no phones, nothing else distracting them, the only experience they get of that really is that 50 minutes in the therapy room.
I also think that the signals that we receive are confusing and overwhelming. Like it's no longer okay to just be a mom or to be a professional. Like, you have to be an amazing mom who does all the right things so that your kid doesn't end up in therapy. You have to be a successful professional. You have to be able to show up at all your kids' events. And now I think that has spilled over into expectations on men as well. No longer is the man just the provider. He's got to be the amazing, ever-present dad who also has to go to all the stuff. And it's hard to check every box and feel like you're showing up and present and 100% in all of these categories. So it's almost impossible to not beat yourself up if you're not, meeting your own expectations that you set for yourself in all of these many categories.
Right. Well, we always feel like we're falling short, but the question is, whose expectations are those? Are those expectations out there, or are they your own? And I think there's also, when you talked about men, there's this gender difference, I think, where men come in and, they talk about all the things you're talking about. They have the same issues that women do about, what's going on in their marriages and what are they like as a parent and how are they feeling about their careers. And How do they feel about their own, relationships with their own parents and siblings? And they have all the same issues, but they don't have the outlet in which to talk about them. So men will come in and they'll say, I've never told anybody this before. And then what they tell me is so, at first, it's so mild to me. It's kind of like that was the secret you were holding. I don't like my neighbor. It's like something, women will come in and they'll say, I've never told anybody this before, except for my mother, my sister, my best friend, right? So they've told a handful of people. But when we actually start talking about these things, the men and the women, they're talking about such similar things as what am I like as a partner, as a parent, as a worker, as any of these, as a human, and so I think it's really important that people are feeling more open to these conversations, because people are really struggling by themselves and they're not talking to anybody about it.
Yeah. I mean, just because I'm a man, I have that perspective. But one of the things that I think about a lot is, what is it like? What does it mean to be a present, responsible, loving husband, father, community-oriented person? I'm supposed to be masculine, but I'm also supposed to be sensitive. And can I hug that person? I probably shouldn't hug anyone anymore. What are the rules? It can be kind of disorienting and confusing. And what I find myself doing is kind of just withdrawing, and isolating rather than confronting these things and trying to figure out how to best navigate all these landmines that are out there.
I see a lot of couples in my practice, and that's something that happens with them too, which is they get confused about what the partner's expectations are of them. And so then they feel like I can't win, and so they just withdraw. It's that's our response to feeling like, well, there's nothing I can do. So, it's like learned helplessness.
Yeah. You wrote an article about, it was an argument against equality within the relationship, within the marriage context.
No, I am not against equality. That's
the wrong way of saying it.
I'm very much for equality.
Yeah.
It was a piece for the New York Times Magazine. And it was about this research that showed that, in a marriage, when men did more feminine chores, that the couples had less sex. And when they did more, when the kind of household duties were divided more along sort of traditional gender lines, like the man will fix the roof or the car or take out the trash, and the woman will do the laundry and the dishes, let's say, that they had more sex. That doesn't mean it was a better marriage.
Right.
That's just about quantity. It doesn't say anything about quality. It just says hey, we have these programs inside of us about gender, and they're very deep seated. So, sometimes women might not see their husband as sexy, even though they say that. If you see your husband doing the dishes, you feel really, really good about him, right?
Uh-huh.
But does that increase your sexual desire?
Right.
And so that was the question in the article. And it didn't come to any conclusion. It was sort of here's the research. Here's what a lot of people are saying about it. We don't really know what this means yet.
That had to be a little controversial, though.
Well, yeah, of course, because, I think a lot of people interpreted it the way that you were first describing it, which is that, that somehow, oh no, somebody's making a case for going back to these traditional marriages that were really unfair to women.
Yeah.
That's not at all what the article was suggesting. Let's
talk about the Atlantic piece about how to keep your kids out of therapy. As a parent of a bunch of kids, this is something I think about a lot. It's actually like a running joke with my 15-year-old daughter. Every time something happens, I'm like, well, this is the thing you're gonna be talking about in therapy. And I find myself often believing that I'm parenting in contraposition to the way that my parents parented me, reactionary, they did that. I don't think that worked. I'm going to go in the other direction, maybe a little too far in the other direction. And yet at the same time, I'll catch myself doing the exact same thing that my parents did. So what I think I'm doing and what I'm actually doing when I have enough self-awareness to understand my impulses and behavior are very different things.
There's this great paper that came out decades ago called The Ghost in the Nursery by Selma Freyberg. And it's about how we think that we're going to be different from our parents, but actually it's really hard not to do exactly what they did at times, right? It's fantastic. It's like a fascinating paper. I highly recommend it. But I think what happens is like the pendulum swung too far in the other direction. And it's great that I think people are having these much richer, I think, relationships with their kids and really understanding their inner lives. But what happens is we're so worried about, any displeasure that our kids are experiencing, any, anxiety or sadness, any of the logical consequences that come with like you didn't get the role in the school play, or you didn't get into that college because you actually didn't work hard, or just you didn't get into that college because lots of people applied and that's what happens in life. You're going to apply for jobs and you might be completely qualified, but you're not going to get that job. But I think, parents are they really have a hard time tolerating any discomfort that their children are experiencing.
Yeah, it's not good.
No, it's not, because then the
kids, creating a generation of people that have no ability to navigate difficulty and setbacks, which does not set themselves up well for life.
Right. So when I wrote that article, it was because I was doing my internship and I saw all these people coming in right out of college saying, my parents were the best. They're my best friends. They made everything so easy for me. I have nothing to complain about. And yet I feel unequipped to be an adult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a parent, your child shouldn't be your best friend. That's a strange violation of emotional boundaries that it says more about your needs as a parent than what's in the child's best interest.
Right. There is, I think, this sense, especially because nowadays, I think a lot of people are feeling lonelier because we don't have community in the same way. So in the past, you could walk outside and the kids would play and the adults would talk and the kids would be like doing their own thing and the adults would be doing their own thing, right? Like nearby. But now it's like, if you want to have some kind of social interaction, you have to like make a plan, and it might not necessarily intersect with your kids' plans. And so we don't have like neighborhoods, community in the same way. A lot of people are really lonely. They don't have a lot of people to talk to. And so what happens is they end up, like getting a lot of emotional gratification from being the helicopter parents. Like, we're going to go to music class now, and then we're going to go do this class, and we're going to go do this. And because they don't really have any adult time. Yeah.
Lisa D'Amour and Susan David both talk about this. I mean, Susan calls it emotional resilience, and Lisa talks about, the importance of allowing our kids to fail and putting them in that position so that they experience how to develop that kind of resilience at a young age. If they're fully formed in their 20s and they're meeting resistance for the first time in their lives, they're ill-equipped to manage it, and it causes all kinds of breakdowns. And I think we see that now getting played out on college campuses at the moment.
Yeah, there's even, I think it was at the University of Chicago, they have this person at the end of when you drop off your kid for freshman year, that the parents weren't willing to separate from their kids. So they said they had the parents like go in this one procession to literally extract them from their children.
Yeah, like bouncers, you need to leave now.
Right, like all the parents come this way and all the kids go this way. So the parents can't accompany the kids to the dorm, and like the kids need to go and meet each other and bond and do all their freshman orientation activities. And the parents weren't willing to leave. So they actually have a protocol, that's laid out now.
That's amazing.
And so, I think that says a lot about how things have changed from one generation to the next. And it's not that one, like the old way was better. It's just that I think there's a happy medium. Yeah. Like you can have this rich relationship with your child, but you also have to prepare your child for adulthood. And you have to have your own life. So many parents nowadays, they don't have a life at all. They don't have a time when like they have their own social life. They're afraid to leave their kids. Their whole social life is about, what am I doing for where's my kid need to be at this moment?
Mm-hmm. And besides the sort of inability to navigate challenges later in life, what are some of the other what is the symptomology that ends up showing up in these kids later in life?
They can't access their feelings. So when they were sad, let's go to Disneyland, or if something happened that made them sad, like, well, at lunch, so-and-so wouldn't sit with me today. The phone call happens to the school.
Somebody's
I understand.
fixing the problem all the time.
Right. Someone's fixing their problem for them. We're going to erase your sadness right now. We don't want you to experience that. But the thing is, if the kid could experience that, they could actually problem solve too. They would come up with a good solution. Or they would experience rejection, which is part of life.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, what is my kid going to do? Well, your kid will probably find other friends. Your kid will probably find a way to eat lunch with somebody where it's a comfortable situation.
And why is that so difficult for us as parents to take that step back?
I think that part of it is that we remember how hard it was when we were kids. Like if we experienced rejection and we project that onto our kid, like that's going to scar you. And it won't necessarily do that if you can support your kid and say, that sounds really hard. What happened at lunch, and then you just let your kid talk and they'll come up with something. But if your kid thinks you're going to fix it every time something goes wrong, they're going to come to you and say, I'm sad about this. I didn't like what happened here. And they're going to expect that you're going to either give them a solution or you're going to fix it, by calling the school or calling the other parent with whom they had a conflict. Yeah.
And then they have no acuity for doing that themselves.
Right. And then they get into the workplace. And what happens is people say these kids are like, they have a sense of entitlement. They don't think that they should be doing menial tasks because everyone told them they were so special and they were so wonderful. And all of a sudden it's like, what do you mean I need to get you coffee? I have a college degree.
Yeah.
Whereas that was expected before. That was part of the job. You want to learn the job? Okay, part of it is you're going to have to do things that feel useless.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're going to be in these meetings.
Yeah.
So you get the coffee, but you get to sit in that meeting and learn how to produce that show or how to negotiate that deal or whatever you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, in your own personal case, it's like you went to Yale, you went to Stanford, and then you became an assistant in Hollywood, right? And we all know what that looks like.
Yes. It was not glamorous.
Yeah. I want to talk about that in a minute, but to kind of stay on this track. So outside of the helicopter parenting and the tiger mom kind of scenario, what about the other side of the spectrum? Like I feel like with my 15-year-old, my wife and I have given her a very long leash. Like we're probably on the other side of that equation. What are the perils of too much freedom and allowing this person like a very wide berth to experience their life?
You want to give them enough freedom where, they're ready for it, but, or maybe they're, where they're comfortable with it. You want it to come from them too, right? So, my son is 13 and, I leave him for periods of time, right? Meaning like I'll go do something. I might go have dinner with a friend. And he's doing his homework at home, and I'm close by. Some people say, wait, no one's with your kid? And it's like, when I was 13, I was actually babysitting.
Yeah.
When I was 13, I was the person who was taking care of the little kids in the house. He's perfectly capable of sitting at home and doing his homework. And he's a really reliable kid. Like, I know he's not going to be like playing Fortnite while I'm gone.
Right.
So, you want to give them that. Like, he likes that.
Well, they develop a sense of agency over their own lives.
And they feel, and there's a confidence about that. Like, he likes it. He's like, oh, no one's here. This is really cool, right? He gets to choose how he spends his time, and he knows he doesn't just have to do his homework. Like he can do other things that are enjoyable. But what goes
into raising that child such that they do make the choice to do their homework when you're not there and they're not on Fortnite?
I think that giving kids freedom makes them more responsible. That if the leash is too tight, they're going to be like, I never get to do this. I have to do this any minute I get freedom. I'm going to do all these other things. He has enough freedom where, he knows if he has time, he'll do his homework. He wants to do his homework because he doesn't want to leave it to the last minute and then feel stressed. So it's about his stress level. It's for him, not for me.
Right.
But he's not just going to sit and do his homework. I mean, he'll do other things. Like he might draw, or he might read a book, or he might, who knows?
Does he have an iPhone?
He might. No, he doesnn't.
Yeah.
But he's getting one this year. Probably, I would say by 8th grade.
It's going to be. That'll be an interesting.
We have a contract.
You do? Tell me what that contract is.
So I'm writing it. I'm writing it because we're in the process of negotiating, getting one. It's just a contract that's like here. It's like one page. It's not like, it's kind of like the basic rules. Like here's what you've got the phone for. Here's how to use it. Here's how not to use it. If I find you doing these things, here's what happens to the phone. It's just very clear. So there's no question about sort of like what's appropriate.
And certain apps that can be used and others that can't, or
it's not that specific. It's kind of like, you will be respectful of people when you use the phone. Like you're not going to like say mean things about people on social media or texting to your friends. Like you're not going to use it for that purpose.
Yeah.
It doesn't belong, like after a certain hour, it goes off. Basic things about like when I call, you need to answer.
Right.
Those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I struggle with my own attachment and addiction issues with the mobile device, and I'm seeing it played out in my kids, and particularly my 15-year-old daughter. Like it's just so powerful. It has the capacity to just override all of your better impulses and
it does
hold you hostage. So I think the rules are super important, and then consistently enforcing them and applying them.
Right. Like we don't have phones at the table ever. We don't, because we're having a meal.
Right.
And I think that people think that's weird, that we're Amish or something, it's like, we're not. It's just that it's mealtime. Like why should our phones be at the table?
Right.
So just things like that, but we're not, but we use technology. I use technology all the time. So it's not being anti-technology. It's just saying technology has a place in our lives, but we don't want to drown in it.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you got to this place, because you have a very interesting, unique, circuitous route to doing what you do.
Yeah, I always used to say that I was either very versatile or very confused, and probably a bit of both.
Well, now it's
but
like
more confused, I think, than versatile, because I'm actually not that versatile.
But the thing is, like, it's that thing where you look in the rearview mirror and it all lines up perfectly, because all these things inform each other so well.
That's right. So I didn't realize, that I was actually doing the same thing. So I was basically working in story and the human condition just from different angles. So when I started out after college, I started working in the entertainment business, and I was doing motion picture, film development, and then I moved over to do TV development. And I was like a baby executive at NBC the first year that two very successful shows happened to premiere. One of them was Friends, and one of them was ER.
So I know you worked on ER. Did you work on Friends also?
So once it went over to current programming, not really, because I was in development, but in development, yes. And so that first year, yes. And, it was interesting because in ER, we had this medical consultant who was this ER doc. And he would, make sure that everything was accurate, that the trauma-based scenes were choreographed correctly and that the terms were used correctly. And I would hang out in the ER with him because I was really fascinated by that. And at a certain point, I would hang out there a little more than I should have been. And he said to me, you seem much more interested in what we're doing here than what you're doing back at the office. And he's like, maybe you should go to medical school. And I was like 27, and I said, I wasn't even a science major. I was a French literature major. I'm not going to medical school. But the more, and I thought this is just a hobby. Yeah. But then, I started hanging out with like other doctors, in other hospitals, and I was like obsessed with it. And it was sort of like, when you're telling stories on television, I loved ER because there were these very authentic feeling, rich human experiences. And I think that's why the show was such a success. But then you see the real stories, when you go into the ER, you go into, wherever you're shadowing these doctors. And it was like, wow, this is what it's all about. You're at that stage in life where you think, this is what it's all about.
And would you come back from one of those experiences and share with the writer's room what you'd experienced? And did any of that end up in any of the shows?
Really, Joe, this consultant, was the one who interfaced with them in that way. But I would come back, certainly you could add your 2 cents. But really, it was more of a personal thing. It was like, oh, this is fascinating. And at a certain point, I realized that I couldn't deny that this was not just a hobby. And so I took all the pre-med classes and I went up to Stanford for medical school.
That's crazy. So you're 27 at the time.
Well, now I'm like almost 30 because I had to take all the classes. And
that is like such a huge life shift and commitment to take on at that stage in life.
Yeah, it was.
So did you do the pre-med? You took like the pre-med core, all the courses that you had to take while you were still working at NBC?
No, I left NBC and I started writing. I became, which is funny because, again, the writing, I was so interested in, I think seeing all the writers when you're at the network, I felt like, oh, I really like writing. I don't want to write on a show. But I decided to kind of do journalism. Like I could freelance and then I could take my pre-med classes. Right. So that's what I did. So I supported myself with the freelancing and then I took the pre-med classes. And
just down here in Los Angeles? Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. And then and I took the MCAT and I applied to med schools. And, I'm this, I was old at that point. Old in the sense of like most people applying are seniors in college.
Yeah.
And I, and at the time I didn't really know what I wanted to do in medicine. I didn't realize at the time that what I was in love with was like these relationships that you have with the patients and being involved in these incredible life moments. And so I went up to medical school and all of my professors started talking about this newfangled thing called managed care. And, they were really frustrated because they had these practices that were very much their calling. And all of a sudden they had these 15-minute visits and, the insurance companies were telling them what to do. And they had to see so many people in the course of a day and the whole landscape was changing. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do the kind, I had this like fantasy of being the family doctor who guides people through their lives.
And this romantic idea that just got pulled out from underneath you.
It did.
What exactly that relationship was going to look like.
It did. Yeah. And so, and while I was there, because I had started writing, I thought, well, I'll go be a journalist and I can really get involved in people's stories in this deeper way. And so I did. And I was a journalist for about a decade when I had my baby.
So you left medical school after like 2 years,
2 years.
Right? Yeah. Okay. And I have to just say, like, you're somebody who, when you set your mind to do something, like you do it. You're like, I'm going to go to medical school. And then you're at Stanford Medical School. I'm going to be a journalist. And then you're publishing everywhere. Like, amazing.
It's in when you look at it that way, like when I look back on it, I think it's kind of amazing. But at the time it was kind of like everything felt like there was some internal motor that said like, you need to go to medical school, right? You need to, and then I got there and I realized it wasn't going to be the right thing. And you need to do this as a journalist because my passion, which I didn't realize it was all about story in the human condition from whatever angle, whether it was like, on ER or whether it was later, in medical school or later as a journalist. But then I had my child and, like we were talking about parenting can be really isolating nowadays.
Yeah.
And I realized like the UPS guy would come with all of his deliveries and I got a lot of deliveries at the time. And I'd be like, how about those diapers? And do you have kids? And how's the weather? And he would literally be backing up to his big brown truck. And I'm like, I need some kind of adult interaction in my profession every day. And I loved my child, by the way, PS, I love you, honey. But it was like there was something that was missing. And so I called up the dean at Stanford Medical School. I'd become very close with her when I was there. And I said, maybe I should come back and do psychiatry. Because I was very clear that like, I love like the way the mind works. That's what I was really into at the time.
But also, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but like, a normal impulse might have been like, well, maybe I'll join a book club or I'll go to yoga or something like that. You're like, I'm going back to medical school. I
wanted to do it in a really like intentional way. It wasn't like a hobby. It was like, I want to do this as my calling. So I said, maybe I should come back and do psychiatry because then I could, do the things that I'm doing, but I would have interactions with people and they'd be meaningful. And she said, I think that I remember how you talked about this in medical school. And I think that if you went back, had to finish medical school, do internship, do residency with a baby, with a toddler, and then you'd basically be prescribing Celexa in 15-minute intervals. Right. You could do talk therapy, but why do you want to go through all of that when you can get a graduate degree in clinical psychology, focus less on medication management and focus on these, the kind of relationships that you want to have as a therapist. And it was one of those things where, how people talk about aha moments and we don't get very many of them in life? This was one of them where it was like, oh, all the puzzle pieces. Somebody just put the missing piece of the puzzle into the puzzle and now I can see it. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what I need to do. And that's what I did. And I realized that I went from telling people stories as a journalist to helping people change their stories as a therapist. And I still do both. I wouldn't want to do one without the other. So I have a part-time practice and I have a part-time journalism career.
And has your experience as a journalist made you a better therapist?
Absolutely.
And
no
vice
question.
Versa?
They very much inform each other.
Explain that, like in what way? Like how do they complement each other?
I feel like as a therapist, I'm almost working as an editor. So people come in with a story, as we've talked about, and the version of the story that they come in with usually has some problems with it, like a first draft does. And, it's sort of like, well, is the protagonist moving forward or is the protagonist going in circles? And who are the heroes in this story and who are the villains in the story? Right. Like in my example, boyfriend was the villain at first, but as you read the book, you realize, oh, wait a minute, he's not a villain. He's a really good guy. And you watch that change and you see like, I was responsible for part of this too. And so when people come in, I want to help them edit their stories. They need a massive rewrite usually. That's what's keeping them stuck. And so I think when we look at character, motivation, arc of a person's life, that's embedded in story. So I think that's how, they're kind of in conversation with each other. And I think as a journalist and as a writer, even writing this book, you look at, well, how am I telling this story? Is this true to the experience? Is this emotionally true?
Yeah, and they're also different, though. I mean, as a journalist, you're trying to track down some objective truth, and you have to keep some distance between yourself and that story. Whereas the patient-therapist relationship is a much more intimate one. I mean, there's boundaries as well, but where does the journalist path and the therapist path kind of part ways or distinguish themselves from each other?
Well, I would say they're not as different as you think they are, because I feel like as a journalist, you do insert yourself into the story a little bit. You're not the story, but you're forming a relationship with that person when you're asking those questions. And I think as a therapist, I have a lot of I would say training, but also it's an instinct after a while. Like, how do you get people to talk about what you really want them to be talking about?
Well, you can weaponize that, right? Like if you're chasing down a story and you're interviewing someone and they're being evasive, you have a toolbox to try to get them to reveal something they perhaps might not ordinarily do because you know exactly how to get to it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say weaponize it though, because I feel like it's the story. It's but I also feel like I don't have a malicious intent.
Right.
That I want to tell the story because it's an important story, not because I want to make them look bad. And whatever I tell about them is not going to make them look bad because I don't tell those kinds of stories. So basically, I want to get to the truth of their story. And so how do I get to the truth of their story, even though they may feel reluctant to share that?
And what do you decide? How do you make decisions about what to write about as a journalist?
Usually there's some question that I see played out in different ways in the culture, and I want to tackle it from a different angle. So like in the parenting story, for example, right? Lots of people had written about helicopter parenting. I was interested in what's happening with all these people who are coming in to see me, and they had these great childhoods. It's the opposite of what people think of therapy, and they're depressed or anxious or, unable to kind of function in the ways that they hope to. In the story that you were talking about with the New York Times, about, like what's happening in marriages. I'm really interested. I see a lot of couples, and I was curious about this, that on the one hand, people will say to their husbands, like, I want you to be more sensitive. I want you to tell me how you're really feeling. And then they do. And then in the therapy room, the women will be like, oh my God, he cried, and they don't, it's like, I want you to be sensitive, but not so sensitive that I feel unsafe. Well, why does that make you feel unsafe? What is sort of this hardwired gender idea that they have? You're asking for one thing, and then when he gives it to you, you're repulsed by it.
Yeah. In your practice, treating couples, what is a recurring thing that you see? Like what are people struggling with in terms of how to relate to each other and have productive relationships?
I think partly for younger couples, they don't have a lot of experience relating because they grew up in sort of the age of technology. They didn't date in the same way that earlier generations dated, so they have less experience with like what happens when relationships don't look like the movies. They don't have a lot of maybe communication skills. They have a lot of unrealistic expectations of what their partner can provide for them or what a partner should provide for them. He's got to be like, or she has to be my best friend, my, rock my world in bed every single time, read my mind, have, be telepathic, not hurt me in any way. They just don't understand sort of like what happens in relationships. They don't understand sort of what we call rupture and repair, that people hurt each other or make mistakes all the time. The question is, how do you guys deal with that and how do you repair it?
What do you think about in treating those people or counseling those people? Like, what does a healthy relationship look like in terms of how two people are interacting productively?
I think when they can hear each other and understand that everything that each of them thinks is subjective. That, like when somebody, like if you see a couple and they'll say, here's what happened, and the other person says, here's what happened. Both things happened. This is the experience of each person. So they're parallel stories that happened. And there's some, like in the Venn diagram, there's some overlap where they agree on sort of, but they had different experiences of the same situation. And so a lot of times people will say something like, well, you don't listen to me. And I always say to that person, if you want someone to listen to you, ask yourself, how well do I listen to that person?
People don't want to hear that.
But it's so helpful. And when they do hear it, it really makes them stop cold in the therapy room because they're not hearing it in a critical way. They're hearing it like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. Yeah. Like I'm talking so much because I'm trying to make my point. I'm trying to get this person to hear me by talking a lot. And the way that I can get this person to hear me is by listening to that person. And when I was training, a supervisor said to me, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason for that ratio.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's very difficult to not project upon that other person this idea of who you think they are and who they should be. And mentally, we create this framework and a rule book for how that person should behave to meet our needs, right? And this is a sort of an unspoken social contract that's going in two directions, and it's inevitable that contract is going to get broken. And when we're projecting too much onto that other person, that's what creates conflict and heartbreak and all the rest. And my wife and I have been together for a very long time, and one of the things that we've worked hard on is to have our own independent lives that we're not looking to the other person to, quote unquote, complete each other. Like we are complete, self-sustaining organisms in our own right. And, we navigate the world together, but also separately and kind of respect each other in our discrete, separate paths.
Yeah, that's so important. And I also think that a lot of couples, they don't understand that they need to have their lives together before they meet this person. I don't mean totally together. You're going to evolve and you change in the course of your marriage, right? You're a different person in your 20s than you are in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, et cetera. But I think that if you feel like this hole or this emptiness and you feel like this other person's going to fill that for you, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right. But that's an epidemic. I mean, that is just what so many people do.
Yeah. I also think that people, going back to, what people attributing something like the reason that somebody's acting a way toward you. So many people are wrong. They're just flat out wrong. Like, you when you did this, it was because you wanted this. It's like, no, that's not why I said that or did that, right? And they really need to hear how wrong their projections can be. for them to start having different kinds of conversations. So they aren't, often people are having basically the same fight every week. So I don't do couples therapy where we analyze the fight of the week. I think that gets us nowhere. I want to know the pattern underlying it so that you don't keep having these kinds of fights.
Right.
I don't need to know the specifics of every single fight. I want to see, what is this pattern? What is this conflict that you repeatedly get into that creates the different fights that you're having?
Why is it that we tend to seek out partners that reflect the way that we were parented?
So I talk about that.
Yeah, when it was unhealthy. Like, the example in your book of the woman who ends up in all these relationships, that mirrors her experience as a young girl.
Right. It's almost like what you said about parenting, that we say we're going to do the opposite of what our parents did and that we do sort of the same thing.
We do the same thing anyway,
It's the thing about that is with Charlotte, she doesn't realize that she keeps saying, well, none of these men, I can't seem to find a guy who wants a relationship, but she keeps picking these guys who are very much like her parents were, which is sort of like sometimes they're very present and sometimes they're not. They're always keeping her guessing. And we grow up and we say, I don't want that. That felt bad. I want something different. But it's almost like we have radar for the familiar.
Yeah.
And if you're not aware of it, you're going to keep choosing people who tap into that very familiar feeling of home. It almost feels like home to you, even if home was miserable.
Right. Even
you're
if
like,
super
I'm home.
Dysfunctional.
Right. You're like, oh, that feels
kind
like my teddy bear. That feels like my teddy bear. I recognize that. And the problem is that if you go outside of your comfort zone, if she were to pick somebody who was available to her and present and wanted a relationship, she would feel like what she would do with him when she's, oh, I'm not attracted to him.
Right.
It feels foreign. Why
can't we be attracted to the person that's good for us?
Because it felt foreign to her, right? It was like, because it's scary to go outside of your comfort zone. All of a sudden, you're in this strange land and you don't know the customs in this land. You don't speak the language in this land. It's so much more comfortable to cling to the familiar of, oh, I know what that's like to be on edge and wonder if he calls. I know exactly what that's like. I grew up like that.
Right. What's confusing about that, though, is I can understand intellectually, like, oh, that's uncomfortable and confusing, but why then there's the sexual attraction component to it. It's like, why am I sexually attracted to the person that's not good for me, and I can't find myself sexually attracted to the person that, like, how does the sexuality aspect of it get confounded with the other confusing part?
Well, I think the attraction is holistic. It's not, it's not compartmentalized like that. So you say, like, I'm really drawn to this person. Like it doesn't even have to be sexual in the sense of people pick friends like that too. They'll pick like friends who are not reliable or friends who are kind of flaky or friends who are addicted if their parents were addicted. They tend to kind of recapitulate whatever they grew up in until they really, really understand it. And I don't mean just have an awareness of it. In the book, I say insight is the booby prize of therapy, because you can have all the insight in the world, like, oh, now I understand why I keep picking those guys. But if you don't make changes out in the world, i.e. pick other guys, the insight is useless. So many times people in couples therapy will say, like, oh, now I understand why, I get really triggered by that when you do that, and why I react that way. But then they don't change anything.
Yeah.
Well, you're wasting your time if you're not going to change anything. So I think in therapy, you have to be both vulnerable and accountable. So you have to be vulnerable, but you also have to be accountable for what are you going to do with the work that we're doing? How are you going to make some tangible changes in your behavior when you leave here?
The change part is so hard.
Right. And people don't realize that. They think, oh, it's positive change, so it should be easy because people want something better to happen. But with every change comes loss. Yeah.
The revelation feels like progress, but it's actually not doing anything. I mean, I've been sober a long time, and, the adage in 12-step is self-knowledge will avail you nothing.
Right.
And when people say to me, like, well, why do you think you were an alcoholic? Like, what happened when and I've learned, like, it's interesting to explore that, but I could spend all of my time trying to deconstruct that, and it actually doesn't help. It doesn't inform how I'm going to make decisions going forward. I have this toolbox now, and I apply these tools to how I make decisions and how I run things by other people that have allowed me to maintain my sobriety and become a more productive member of society. So for me, it's about like the actionable tools. And I think it is like, it's so difficult for people change. And in my experience, in my own personal experience, like I didn't change until I was in, the pain of continuing on the path that I was on exceeded the fear of, the unknown. Should I change?
Right.
So, what is that like? Like, how do you get people, short of having to have some, cataclysm in their life, to make those adjustments and actually, put your information and your insight into forward motion?
There was something that my therapist said to me that I write about in the book, where he said, where I was like just feeling trapped by all of these sort of external circumstances, and I wasn't willing to make changes. I wasn't willing to look at what I could do differently. And he said, you remind me of this cartoon, and it's of this prisoner shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out. But on the right and the left, the bars are open. Uh-huh. And it was like, at first I thought, oh, that's really cheesy. Uh-huh. But then I thought, wait a minute, he's right. Because so many of us would rather be the prisoner shaking the bars saying, I can't do anything about this. We don't want to look that it's open on the right or the left. Because then if we walk out and we go into the sunlight and there are no bars and we're free, with freedom comes responsibility. And now we have to take responsibility for our lives. We can't say, oh, the problem is, that I'm trapped here.
Right.
Now it's like anything that happens is I'm responsible for that. And so change is hard for that reason. It's easier to feel trapped in the whatever childhood drama, right, that you're reenacting, than to actually do something different where you might have to be responsible for your choices.
And when you're trapped in that paradigm, you can get a lot of idiot compassion coming your way.
Yes. And that feels so delicious,
Yes.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so good, right?
Yeah.
I'm such a victim.
Yeah.
I know you are. Isn't it terrible? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the idea that you could be free, which is awesome, is terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't know. And especially if you grew up without that kind of freedom, without that emotional freedom, all of a sudden you feel like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be free. It just feels too risky to go out there and do something different.
Do you think everybody should be in therapy?
People, since the book came out, everybody asked me that, and they do, and I think it's interesting. I'm not, I think everybody can benefit from therapy. Mm-hmm. I don't think everybody needs to be in therapy. But I do think this. I think that so many times people come to therapy later than they should. Meaning that, we think about our physical well-being different from our emotional well-being. So if somebody feels like something is wrong with their body, like you're having chest pain, you'll probably go to the cardiologist before you have a massive heart attack. Uh-huh. But if somebody feels like, oh, something doesn't feel right emotionally, we tend to ignore it or minimize it. Well, I have a roof over my head and food on the table, so I don't really need help. And what happens is they think that they can just make the feelings go away or not pay attention to them. But when you don't pay attention to feelings, they become stronger. And they come out, in a behavior, in a irritability, or in a short-temperedness, or in a, self-defeating, self-sabotaging way of being in the world, whatever it is, or in an inability to sleep, whatever. And so people then don't come to therapy until they're having some kind of crisis. And it's like they're having an emotional heart attack. Like, why would you wait that long? Because you've suffered unnecessarily for all of this time. And also it's harder to treat once you're really, once you've gotten to that point.
Yeah. There's no downside.
Well, time, money, the biggest downside, I think, for people, even though there are logistical problems that are very real, is that a lot of people kind of unconsciously know that if they go to therapy, they might need to make changes.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, if I go to therapy,
who wants that? Like,
I might need to do something different in my life. I might need to be uncomfortable, and I don't want to be uncomfortable. So I'd rather just just keep things the way they are.
Right.
Status quo.
And so what's next for you?
I'm still writing I have my practice, and I have my weekly Dear Therapist column that I write for The Atlantic every Monday. And I am about to do a TED Talk that I'm writing. Are? Yes.
Oh, wow. Can you talk about what it is, or is that under wraps?
I'm taping it in September.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is that for like TED Med or for the main TED?
Main TED.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
The red circle.
Oh my goodness. Are you nervous about that?
Not yet, but I know I will be.
Yeah. That's a super cool opportunity.
Yeah.
And tell me about the book is being developed into a television show with Lonelier. So this brings you back full circle once again.
Right. And
where
I
all
think
these worlds intersect for yourself.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that I worked in television before, because one of the things I think about as we're adapting the book for television is that, I think that a lot of the ways that therapists have been portrayed in the media give people the wrong impression, and it keeps people from getting help. And so, I think that therapists are either like, like the very distant, cold therapist, or they're like the hot mess, the train wreck, right? And the therapists that I know are neither. And so this television show is about a person who happens to be a therapist, but it's not about a therapist, if that makes sense. Meaning, she happens to be a therapist. And so you meet her family, you meet, the people that she sees, you obviously are in the therapy room, but it's not about like all of the cliches and tropes about therapy. Just, this happens to be her job.
Right. So it's not like In Treatment.
No.
That show. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And where are you in the stages of development?
It's being written.
It's being written right now.
Yeah.
Are you writing it?
No. I want it to be good.
Or are you tapping into all your entertainment contacts from back in the day?
Well, no. So it's Eva Longoria's company that's producing it, and so
cool.
it's all through them.
Yeah. That's exciting. Well, super nice to talk to you.
So nice to talk to you,
thank
too.
Thank you for sharing with me today. It's fascinating. I could talk about therapy, psychotherapy all day long. The book is amazing. Check it out. Maybe you should talk to someone, and coming to a TED stage soon, right?
Right.
If people want to connect with you, they can go to your website, right? LoriGottlieb.com. Where else?
I'm also at Lori Gottlieb 1 on Twitter, and I just started using Instagram. I still don't know how to use it, but I'm at Lori Gottlieb _author. And if anybody wants to give me a tutorial, I welcome it.
I'm happy to do that. With a 13-year-old about to get an iPhone, I think you're going to have to get up to speed.
That's right.
Maybe Snapchat too.
Well, he told me, he doesn't think that he says Twitter's not cool. Instagram, he's not sure if it's cool. Snapchat is apparently cool.
It's pretty much Snapchat at that age, I think. So anyway, happy to talk to you more.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bonus.
All right, peace.